What's going on, everybody? Welcome to this Real Shark bonus clip with your host, Rob, and Lucas Maximus.
Hey everybody, how's it going?
And so, Luke, I wanted to get your take on this conversation I had off air that I was telling you about.
Sure.
This idea of what essentially is called woke culture, or PC culture.
Yeah.
And so I have to tell you about this conversation I had with somebody. It was a fan, and he was discussing with me his the reason he didn't like the movie The Shape of Water. And I told him about how
Okay.
we slam dunked on that film, how it was, essentially Creature from the Black Lagoon, backwards, yada yada. And he was like, "Oh, I didn't like it because it's about angry white men." And I said, "Wait, what?" And he goes, "Yeah."
Okay.
He goes, "Yeah, because it's about how the creature is in love with the monster. The woman's in love with the creature, and basically the communist is okay with it, the black girl's okay with it, and the gay guy's okay with it, and everybody except the white general." And I was all like, "Wait a second." I said, "Wasn't the communist guy trying to get the creature?" And he's like, "No." And I was like, "I think he was." And I was like, "And the general," I was like, "Wasn't he the head of the facility?" And he was like, "Yeah." And I was like, "So thus in the story, wouldn't it make sense if he was angry?" And he was like, "Yeah, but the whole thing is it's about, how the white man is always portrayed now as being angry in films." And I was like, "Okay." And he goes, "And I'm so sick of these movies where they show poor people as the hero. Like, I need to get behind a poor person because they're poor." He goes, "In my life, I've seen poor people aren't exactly always the good people. And all these movies nowadays are about hating the rich." And so I actually had to step back in a second, and I said, I said, "Man, if you hate angry white man films, I bet you really are frustrated at white savior films, huh?" And he was like, "What?" And I was like, "Yeah." I was like, "White savior films, where the white guy comes in and saves everybody." I said, because that happens. I was like, that was basically almost every film. I was like, still is to this day in a sense.
Yeah.
I was like, so I don't understand. I was like, and you always talk. You just told me you didn't like the idea how they always personify a poor person as being the hero. I said, well, can't I say the same thing about the white savior guy in a film?
Yeah.
And he was like, "Oh, I never thought of that." And I was like, "Food for thought, man." And I was like, "And you do know, like, in the early 90s, most films were about, like, the rich bringing up the poor person." I was like, essentially, that's what Mighty Ducks is about a rich white guy bringing up a bunch of poor kids. And I was like, and so this whole idea of, poor person is always portrayed as a hero isn't true. This idea, and like, and I even was like saying too, your whole anger towards the angry white guy in Shape of Water is funny. I said, because those movies are supposed to represent the monster is more human than human, right? We all know that, and you shouldn't stand in the way of whatever love you want to have, blah blah blah. But then I was like, I just don't understand the notation to that. And I was like, even if it's a metaphor for real racism, dressed in the creature feature, why would you be angry? Because wouldn't that be the standard trope of the day? Interracial marriage, white guy angry. I said that's pretty standard.
Yeah.
I said, but it just I don't understand the context of some of these arguments. So it really took me back, and I went home and I started looking around at it, and I found a review by National Review, and all these reviews are from right wing conservative critics.
Yeah. National Review is like the key, like, right wing publication.
Yes.
It kind of has an air of a little bit more respectability, but not much. It's mostly just usual kind of like angry Republican lunacy, but
I find this kind of stuff in films toxic, absolutely insanely toxic. There was no, and it brought to me. We had this conversation a while back, and now I'm going to have a full-on disagreement with you, and I hope you'll even come to my side on this. Is when I hear someone say anyone can be a movie critic, and I'm going to say no, not everyone can, because in that conversation I had with this guy, I was like, wow, I cannot believe you would formulate an opinion based on the present circumstances of films in the theaters when you have no knowledge of film history. You have no knowledge of films in the 90s. You have no knowledge of films in the early 2000s. And you want to sit here and say, "Oh, this is just woke culture. This is just PC culture." You have no fucking idea what you're really talking about, essentially. because you don't even know the context or the history of what you're talking about. Then someone even told me too recently the only reason black actors are even in movies is because of affirmative action. It's like, that's not true at all.
Well, that's racist.
Yeah,
that's unequivocally racist.
Yeah, I said that's not true at all. But
Yeah.
this whole idea of like everything is a woke culture when you see a black actor in a new movie, it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. Sure. And the anger that is, on one particular part, like I said, in The Shape of Water, where the angry white guy, I was like, you're just basically inflaming, you're just basically making one part of the script, and you're just, and you're making it bigger. I said, I can do the same thing. I said, look, Cloverfield is a love film. And he's like, no, it's not. And I was like, well, yeah, it is. I said, enough of that movie is driven by this man trying to get to his girlfriend. Everything else doesn't matter, essentially. I said, thus, it is a love film. And he's like, well, I guess you can make that argument. I said, no, that's not an argument. I'm just taking one part of the script and I'm making it bigger than what it is. I was like, that's all I'm doing. That's one aspect. I said, and that's what you're doing. You're being a little sensitive to this angry white guy myth, but I'm like, for almost decades and decades, it's been exactly the opposite. So why are you mad when someone calls it out, or if it is a thing?
It is kind of and I think the reaction to what they call so-called woke culture has kind of been born out of a knee-jerk reaction, and I mean that's what the phrase reactionary is that when you see what you perceive as social change, you sort of react negatively to anything like that. And for a good example, the Marvel movies back to back of Black Panther and Captain Marvel. Now, regardless of the merits of either film, I'm not going to argue about that. That's its own conversation.
Yes.
But there was definitely, in both cases, there was like a lot of praise because it was the first female-led Marvel movie, and then also the first majority black cast. Now, whether the themes actually truly represent woke culture is its own thing. But in that regard, the idea that they were both representative of like a push towards progressive ideas, that definitely brings out a knee-jerk reaction to reactionary people.
Yeah, but they don't know the history of films. I mean, people don't know that African Americans have been misrepresented in films, and women have been misrepresented in films. And it's like, we talked about this a lot. It's like when you swing that pendulum so far, it's like you're the ones making that a big deal. You're the ones talking about race. You're the one talking about gender in films. No one else is here. You're not breaking down the mechanics of the story. You're not talking about whether this is an original movie or a redressed, a movie as something else. You're not discussing that. You're talking about whether the guy made you feel bad or not.
And this is because, and it's hard to say whether or not these guys are ever going to act in good faith anyway. And whether their arguments are actually trying to add to a conversation, because in most cases it's not. What it's built out of is, in the 2000s, in the 2010s, as we're going into the 20s, there is a perception, especially in the cultural left, or what's been kind of come online is, attempting to broaden what was tropes. And again, that idea for, eventually the word was diversity, it was eventually changed to inclusion, and it'll probably change overall, but it is trying to address, like, the way in which most film up until this point has been within a very specific mindset. Most directors up to this point, they were white male, not all, but a good portion, and of course there's always been exceptions to this rule, but since so much of American film has been built around white males, there's been an attempt to kind of broaden that idea. Now, in some cases, especially with what we call the reactionaries, this is perceived as a type of like trying to pushing them out, and they perceive it as the criticism is that we're trying to completely get rid of the idea of traditional film culture. So any movie that, it doesn't have a white male in it, doesn't have a white male as the main character, has a representative as a white male.
And I think that's absolute dog whistling bullshit.
Yeah. they kind of see this as like, oh, they're just marching forward to demonize or white people.
Yeah, that I don't believe that at all.
I don't think so either. I think if you actually broke down most films, we still really aren't getting close to necessarily what, woke, quote unquote, because woke
That's what I'm saying.
so many things, and because, a lot of that, especially in pop culture, woke can often be pretty, pretty base level, pretty shallow, and not everyone has the same, what's the word? The same description of what woke even means.
Yeah. I mean, what I keep hearing, it's like when you call out anything that has been like, racial. So basically, the argument is if you feel like African Americans are being misrepresented in like a community, when they put forth a African American leader, or even, let's say an African American actor in film, that's woke. It's like, okay, calm down. It's like just to call out injustice or say, hey, that's wrong, man. It's like, oh, you're woke. It's like, to me, that sounds like an excuse to be unempathetic or or dare I say, not sympathetic towards anything. Really, you're just trying to keep a traditional like perception of films that have been going on forever. And it's like, you know what? Grow up. Films change. History changes. You're not even talking about films. You're talking about a political race lens that you put on when you watch these movies. You're not talking about the story. You're talking about your own outrage that you can't even drop at the door to watch a movie.
It is dumb and ridiculous. And some of this is, of course, still reactionary people. Some of this is, again, this childish adolescent mindset, and this is kind of across the board. By like an entire generation of people who have only read young adult novels,
yeah,
only seen comic book movies.
Oh yeah, that's what I'm noticing.
Kind of based in like it is a very, very undeveloped, almost infantile understanding of mass media. It is particularly averse to excessive complexity. Nuance, and anything beyond just the most basic tropes that you see over and over and over again.
That's what I'm saying. So, it's like films are a reflection of the times we live in. It's just, that's a fact. And it's obvious that's the reflection, the world is going in. And it's like, I'm sorry to say there's a group of people that think this is woke to see a African American in a film or to see a female lead role. And, I understand the counter argument to the female lead role because I've had it with people on this show about how it's about writing just good characters and not basically writing females as male roles. That is, that's something that happens too. Just write a good original character, as we've talked about with Sigourney Weaver. But, I digress. It's a whole other topic. But to just sit there and dog whistle all the time and not give any reasoning for why something is bad or good, just to say that, it made me feel this way, because here's a prime example of what I mean. I read an article just today about Al Pacino's new show, about the Nazi hunting one, and it was on National Review. And the guy basically wrote
what do you got to say?
The guy who wrote the review is this. He said, basically, this show is basically CSI. Well, I'll just sum up what he said, and I tweeted it to him. I said, you didn't really say anything bad about the show besides it was a revamped CSI with Nazis. Then you went on to say that the reason it was bad was because it was a Jewish minority revenge show. You were mad because they were hunting Nazis. And I was like, your political / race lens you put on to watch films is disgusting and should not be taken seriously. And that's why, Real Sharks, we've always talked about this off air for you, our audience. And, we're going to say we don't think any of you are like this because we know you listen to the show and you're a little more educated than that. But, we have to draw a line somewhere. And when it comes to stupid reviews like that, I'm going to draw a line, and I'm going to say publicly on air here that this show will counteract any kind of bullshit reviews based on any kind of race or gender, because they are just bullshit. If you're not talking about the story, if you're not talking about character arcs, if you're not talking about anything relevant to the film itself besides your own political bias in which you stand by, then you don't need to be watching films, and you need to just get the fuck out of the way.
Exactly. It also comes down to their perception of what they think films are supposed to do.
Right.
So especially in reactionary groups, it's this They often talk about, I mean, they'll say woke culture, they'll say PC culture. They also talk about like the liberal agenda. There's
Right.
often this perception that, obviously, and it is true that Hollywood is overwhelmingly liberal, but it's that perception that they're making these movies with the specific intent to change minds into a particular liberal or progressive PC mindset.
Let me stop you right there too. Let me stop you right there too. But we always hear the liberal Hollywood argument too. Wasn't there a company called Fox for a long time that had every opportunity to make decent films? I think they forget about this. I love it when they say liberal Hollywood. Not to say this is anything to your argument, but I love when they say liberal Hollywood, because it's like, yeah, there was a studio called Fox, and they couldn't even produce good comic films, let alone good movies, half the fucking time anyway. So continue.
Yeah, because it's like that perception that that they're specifically making these films to change over cultures. And it is weird because, again, that's what a lot of the right wing people like explicitly try to do. Any movie that like is often promoted by them, anything excessively evangelical Christian, excessively right wing, most of these low budget anyway.
Yeah.
But it's like that is explicitly trying to do the agenda. A lot of it's projection, and it kind of comes down to the fact that mainstream wise, conservatives do not have a grip on mass culture. They have their in America especially, they have a very specific stronghold of culture. A lot of that's in Christian media, country music, and then of course all the crazy neckbeards on YouTube. Men's rights activists, that sphere. But in the broader scheme, there's definitely a perception that like the left or the liberals, they're largely, their sphere of influence is much larger, and whether that's true is up to debate, and it's a lot more complicated than just right or left. But whenever you hear complaints about the woke culture or anything like that, it is very rarely a good faith argument about pushing agenda over quality of a film. It is explicitly people, often reactionary, just simply resentful that their worldview is not being represented on film.
Yeah.
Or not being represented in the exact specific way they want it to be. So, I don't think that there's much merit to it. And again, it's because of the internet, because of the way social media has these ecosystems can thrive and like sustain themselves by essentially just basically being the same thing to the same audience over and over and over again.
Same argument. This film did this with this race person. This film was pushing this agenda because it had this Mexican in it. Blah blah blah. Even though white people play Mexicans all the time. I mean, I don't get it. So I don't get it. It's like you said. It's a bad faith argument. It's not even in good faith. They're just trying to have this argument for the sense of their worldview is not being represented.
Exactly, and it's what's the phrase I'm going for here? And I think people are often like ignoring like what the common tropes of all representing poor people, like that is, go back to the Bible. That's just the simplest underdog story of all time. It's a simple mechanism of like the powerless versus the powerful.
But let's break it back into films. Think about how many times films have always been about, like Brewster's Millions. I love that film. But what is it about? It's about a poor black man being given a ton of money by a white guy. A white guy who was like his stepdad. He didn't even know who his father was. I mean, not his dad. He didn't even know who the guy's father was. Sorry, that's what he didn't even know who his father was, And he gives him all this money. And it's like, what?
It's of course retreat, and it's not even new. Like every 80s movie was about like a evil, wealthy businessman who's going to destroy the rec center. That's why he had to win the contest.
Right.
Again, this is what happens when your entire frame of reference is either comic book movies, the Star Wars film, and then a couple of video games.
Wow, you nailed it.
It, it's not just them, but it's
No,
such
most of these arguments
a
I hear are from strictly Marvel-driven fans that
yeah, it's
really love Marvel and don't see anything else really.
yeah. Well, they love a specific brand of Marvel because the broad scheme of Marvel's so big, and there's just so much that's happened over the years. It's I've seen it before with even video games as well. It's the perception that like uh, again that it's that woke culture is destroying it, and that's because of the idea that video game companies, comic book companies, writers, developers, artists, anything like that, they are expanding into other audiences that aren't just what the perception is. This is white nerds.
Right.
Which of course there have always been different varieties of audiences ever since the beginning, but the idea of expanding out to other audiences to them is the idea that it's to the detriment of the white nerds.
Yeah.
Basically, they're being pushed out in favor of new audiences and such, which is
That's
a weird
my Iron
play,
Man.
it's a weird perception. So yeah, I I think I'm I like comic books and video games and all that, but I'm not at a point where I can even necessarily be mad at the people being mad. It's such a weird thing to spend all of your time thinking about.
It is weird.
I say this as a guy who's on a movie podcast, but
yeah.
Just
no, I know, man.
Outside for a little bit, guys.
Like, cause me, I hate movies for completely different reasons than people do. I hate movies because, as I almost said it, dude, I almost wrote a whole Facebook post about this. Like, to be a movie critic, you got to understand where a film, like when it came out, what it represented to that time, what it represents culturally now. I said there's always a debate between originality, or is this just a rehashed redress of another film that's being marketed as something else. I said so that's those kind of things are always being at play here, but people are just making assumptions, like you said, just off comic films. They're watching Marvel films. They're just watching, and the guy who I had this conversation with, that's all he does. And all three of those things are exactly what you named he does. Exactly.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's like, and like then it just really got to me, man, because I'm like, I hate films because I hate a movie that, I think I watch a movie and I'll be like, oh, well, that's just like this movie. Oh, that's just like this movie.
Yeah.
Like I told Billy earlier, I read this guy's article. It was one of the biggest articles on the internet. And he wrote about how he thought the Joker movie was just absolute garbage. It was trash. And I was like, okay, so I want to see what else this guy talks about. So I went and I followed his article. And then he has a fucking article about how Underwater was amazing with Kristen Stewart. And I'm like, you don't know shit. Because you didn't even think about how this movie is like Sphere or it's like, Abyss. You didn't think about any of that shit. That's why I'm like, I don't believe anyone can just be a movie critic. Because if you just sit here and talk about the movies in the present time, you kind of don't know what the fuck you're talking about.
Yeah.
That's why it just drives me crazy. Because people will always be like, hey, did you see that movie? And I'm like, no, because it looks just like this movie. You know what I mean? And people are like, oh, how could you say that? And like, I've literally, like my girlfriend has told me, you don't ever enjoy a movie. And like she'll tell me, I don't want to watch that with you because you never enjoy a film. And I was like, what? I was like, what are you saying? I was like, I'm a movie critic. Of course I enjoy movies. And she's like, no, you don't. And I said, you know what? You're right. I said, I don't enjoy most things. I said, because when I watch it, it's like, oh, that's like this. Oh, that's like that. Oh, that's like this.